Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be doing a price prediction based on logarithmic regression. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Now, if you like yourself some dubious speculation, then hold on to your hats because this is going to be one wild ride. The reason I'm doing an update on this video is because I was scrolling through some YouTube comments from the last several weeks, and I noticed that someone made this comment. They said, "But are we bullish on Ben responding to comments on his old videos?" And I responded, maybe. And I looked at this video, and I was watching this video, and if you look at this video, you can see that it was published on November 13th, 2019. And from this video was when I really first started talking about Bitcoin on my channel. Okay, so this was about 2 years ago when we really first started to dive into it. And I want to talk about what we spoke about back then, and then I want to do an update on it and talk about, some of the things we've learned. Where are we today? Are we on schedule? Are we not? Where are we? Okay, so looking at this screenshot, what do we see? What do we see? Well, the speculation was that we should be able to make it to $141,000 by the end of 2021. Okay, this red dot here. This was the speculation back then that Bitcoin should be able to make it to $141,000 by the end of 2021. And again, we put this out in 2019 when Bitcoin was trading for less than 10K. Okay, it was trading for less than 10K at the time. And actually, this was right before this was a few months before the March capitulation that took us all the way back down to this lower regression line here, maybe even a little bit lower. So keep that in mind as well. We did not yet know that we were going to get a March 2020 capitulation. This was before that. This is completely before that. So what I want to do is, this video is a couple years old. And in this video, I even said we have a couple years before this will play out. So we have plenty of time to accumulate. Now we're here, all right? And I want to do an update on it. So, if I just play a little bit of this video,
chance that that's where we're headed. So, this one dropped down 3 lines, this one dropped down 2, and it's basically just a way for you to visualize, these changes in the percentages. And now, if this one drops down 1, so if it just drops down to this blue line, but we extend this blue line out to the halving, so we would expect to potentially go parabolic after the halving. We'll be down here, that we won't be up here, most likely. And if we make it up to this line, let's say it's the same as the last 2 times. So, this one was the end of or around 2013. This peak was the end of 2013. This peak was the end of 2017. So if the next peak occurs at the end of 2021 and it lands on that blue line, it'll be approximately 141,000. But this 141,000 is taken from just this ratio here.
All right, so you guys get the idea, right? This was a long time ago. This was before I had spent a lot more time talking about Bitcoin on my channel, but I just wanted to give you guys the perspective back then, okay? Now, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do an entire update on this, okay, and see where we are today. So, also, I should note that in this chart, you might notice that the percent difference, I got this when, for some reason, I put in the wrong one there. So, as you can see, I am capable of making mistakes because this is not 2,656%. Okay, so let's look at it again, but we're going to do an update, okay? So the first thing we notice is that Bitcoin, at its market cycle bottoms, generally increases by a lot. And the first one over here, it's really hard to get good data from. It really is. The reason is because there were wicks down to like a penny, and if we had wicks down to a penny, then you're looking at over 200x increase right there. But it's also really hard to know what was liquid, what was illiquid. Were people able to trade at those prices? Were they not? And so I normally leave that one out in terms of actually measuring something that we might be able to dubiously speculate on. But we could at least look at the peaks and see where those were. I mean, we just note that this was somewhere between like a penny to 5 pennies. Okay, I think there was a liquidity at around 5 pennies, 5 cents, but there were also some wicks below 5 cents down to even like 1 cent, and it's really hard to know how liquid those were. So from here, what we'll notice is that the market cycle bottoms $2.29, I should say, 177, 3,225, and then we have 31.9, 1151, 19,499. These are like daily closes for these peaks here. And what we'll notice is that the first one is a 7,629% move to the upside. Even from bottom to bottom, this one is a 1,722% move to the upside as measured from bottom to bottom. If we go look at top to top, this first one is a 3,508% move. This is a 1,594% move. Okay, so you can see that the peak to peak, it was cut. I mean, it was cut significantly, a little bit more than half. It was cut from, say, this peak to this peak, and then this peak to this peak, which of course brings into account the diminishing returns argument that we've talked about, which again is not a very popular theory, and that's fine, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I want to draw your attention to the halvings. Okay, now back then when we were first showing that, what did we note? We said, all right, well, the first peak that was the first peak was over here in 2011. It was before the halving, right? It was before the first halving. This one occurred in the summer. The next one occurred in November of 2013. Okay, so we know this one was November of 2013. This one was December of 2017. So we had November of 2013, December of 2017, and then in the video that you just heard, this was before I really went into the idea of like lengthening cycles and whatnot. We said, well, what if the next peak just comes at the end of 2021, like these two, right? So end of 2013, end of 2017, what if the next one comes at the end of 2021? And in the video, as you guys heard, I was dubiously speculating that we should be able to get over 100K, right? 140K seemed perfectly reasonable. 141, I believe, is what I had, something like that. Now, something I want to show is, and we didn't look at it closely back then, is just the time after the halving at which we saw a peak. Okay, so we're going to look at that now. So the first one, this is the time, and I just highlighted it in yellow. The exact number of days is somewhat irrelevant because we're just going to copy and paste this over the next one and see where we currently are. So this is the time it took after the halving, after the first halving, to see a market cycle peak. After this, and note that the intermediate peak was at a very modest $263. Now, the next one, if you overlaid the same time here over the next one, what would you notice? You would say, well, that didn't get us to a market cycle peak, now did it, right? It had actually extended several more months, as you can see. If this had been the market cycle peak, then Bitcoin would have ended up peaking at only about $3,000 if the time after the halving had actually been the same. Okay, so after the first halving, this yellow box or orange box, whatever, more orange I guess, it represents the time until the peak. After the second halving, the orange box would not represent the time until the peak, and in fact you would have to look at something where you add a little bit more time onto it, okay? But here's the catch. Because the first halving happened later in the year, it happened later in the year in 2012, and then the second halving happened in July of 2016, they still both ended up around the end of the year. Okay, so this one was in November, this one was in December, so it pushed it back a month, but note that the halving came months before. So it lengthened by more than just 1 month. Some people might look at this and say, well, this one was November and then this one was December, and say, well, it just lengthened by maybe 2.5 weeks. Well, as measured from the halving, that's not true, because the halving in the first cycle, or sorry, I should say the second cycle, because I consider this one the first cycle, but the first cycle after the first halving, that one happened a couple months sooner, therefore the entire cycle ended up lengthening by several months. Okay, so then we look at this phase and say, all right, well, this is the time it took us to peak after the second halving. Now, do you care to guess what it looks like if we copy this and overlay it here? we've already reached that time limit, right? We've already reached that time limit. And I've said all along, as measured from the halving and as measured from the market cycle bottom, the cycle should lengthen, right? The cycle should lengthen as measured from the halving and as measured from the market cycle bottom. Now, we have now lengthened as measured from the halving, and to the day that Bitcoin went over 64K, that was the day that officially lengthened the cycle as measured from the halving. Okay, that was the exact day. If we had gone to say 67K, a day or two before, and then went back down below the prior all-time high, then the cycle would technically not be lengthened from after the halving, right? But because we waited one extra day, then technically the cycle has now officially lengthened by at least 1 day after the halving. Now, I would speculate that the cycle is going to continue to go on well beyond where we currently are. I think we still have time in this market cycle, okay? So then now the question becomes, right, it's on everyone's mind, is will the cycle lengthen to the point where it extends beyond 2021, or is the cycle going to increase a smaller amount each time? So what I mean by that is this cycle, we just have this data for. The next cycle increased by this amount, okay? I'm just visually showing you, okay? I think visual representations are great. So what if the next cycle, what if the current cycle increased by a smaller amount? And I even left a little white area in there. But what if it increased by a smaller amount? Then if that's the case, then we could have a market cycle peak by the end of 2021. If that is the case, if it's increasing from the halving, but the amount it's increasing is getting smaller and smaller and smaller each time. Okay, so that would be one way to look at it. And again, this is only our third halving. We just don't have enough data points. We simply do not have enough data points to fully know. We have all sorts of theories out there. There's a lot of theories that projected April to be the market cycle top, and I said I was very adamant that no, April is not the market cycle top. We are now proven right on that. There's a lot of people that thought the market cycle peak was going to come a month ago. A lot of people are talking about a September market cycle peak. We said, it's pretty unlikely going to happen, and even Bitcoin typically doesn't do that well in September, if history is any indication. And now the next one, okay, is it going to peak by the end of the year? And it's hard to say at this point, right? It really is, but there is a possibility. We will have to admit, right? There is a possibility that the cycle does peak by the end of the year. I'm still speculating that it will go beyond 2021, but we will take it one step at a time. And look, if Bitcoin is trading, for 150K by mid-December, then there is at least a chance that is the market cycle peak, and that the cycle technically lengthened from the halving, but not in a consequential manner that took it into 2022. Now, if it were to lengthen by the same amount that the last one lengthened by, if we just overlay the same box length, and I still left a little bit of white space in there, but it would still have it go into 2022. Okay, so that would be, if it increases by the same amount, it would have it go into 2022. And you might say, well, that looks kind of weird that it would do that. But another way to visualize it, oh, by the way, this is if it increases by a larger amount, right? If it increases by a larger amount. You might look at that and say, well, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Maybe this will be another way to visualize it, okay? Rather than having those boxes like that, noting that this one was, a certain width, this one got longer, and then if this one gets even longer, maybe it looks something like that. I don't really know. Again, I'm just over here dubiously speculating, right? So where do we go from here? Well, let's look at this for a minute. Okay, and this is what I said in the video. After cycle 1, we fell down 3 logarithmic regression lines, more or less, right? We can round it to 3. We were at the green line, we fell just above this one, so let's just say that's 3 log lines down. This one fell down 2, about 2, a little more than 2, but let's say this one was 3, and this one was 2. And then in the video, if you go watch that video, and I'll even link it in the description below if you guys want to go watch it back from 2019 and laugh at my presentation and how awful my audio quality and video quality was back then. Not that it's any better today, but if it was pretty bad to you back then. I'll link it in the description below if you guys want to go watch that. Now, we look at this and we say, well, what if this one drops 1 logarithmic regression band? Okay? Now that would be the blue one. All right, this blue one. We have not made it to the blue one. In fact, the local top in April of 2021 took us to the green band. All right. Now, if the blue band is ultimately where the market cycle peak is, then where could that theoretically take us, right? Where could that theoretically take us? Well, we know that by the end of the year, the green band is already going to be about 100K, right? The green band's already going to be at approximately 100K by the end of the year. So does that mean that if we go to the blue band, where would that be? Well, you can see it would be well into the 100Ks. It would still be slightly less than 200K, right? It would be slightly less than 200K by the end of the year, all right? So keep that in mind. If we dubiously speculate on drops down from one logarithmic regression band peak to another, we might say, all right, the next one should be at the light blue regression line, which still gives us plenty of potential upside for Bitcoin. Now, from here, if we look at that light blue line and we just draw a line over it, that is the target, right? That's more or less the target. And the idea that I have here is maybe it doesn't matter exactly when we hit the line, but it's just when we do hit it, that could be the signal, right? That could be the signal that, all right, things are too far extended. If it happens by the end of the year and we're trading at like 150K, that could be the signal. If it happens early next year, let's say in mid 2022 or Q1, Q2 of 2022, and we're trading for 180, 190K, that could be the signal. If it goes beyond that, then maybe we could go over 200K, right? It depends on how long it lengthens, of course. But the point here is to say, well, at some point, there's a decent chance we'll hit this blue line, and if we do, that might usher in the market cycle peak. At the current time, we still have plenty of room to move up if that line is to be taken to the bank, which I'm not saying you should take it to the bank, but if you did take it to the bank, it would imply there's still plenty of room to move up. Now, just drawing a line at 200K, I know a lot of people would like to see a $200,000 Bitcoin. For us to get to $200,000, it seems highly likely that the market cycle would need to extend into 2022, okay? So Bitcoin today is trading for 61K, something like that. For us to reach 200K, I would speculate that the market cycle needs to go beyond 2021. It just seems highly unlikely that Bitcoin will go to 200K by the end of the year. But is it possible? Look, anything's possible. I'm not going to discount anything. It'd be like looking at, I certainly didn't expect this move to go up so quickly to 64K. So to say that it can't happen would probably be a little bit irrational for me to say something like that. I'm just speculating that for it to go to 200K, the market cycle would likely need to extend into next year. Okay, something like that, all right? If it came earlier, that's fine. If it came later, that's fine. Now, going back to this chart, I wanted to draw your attention to this ratio that I showed in the video, right? That you guys showed, I showed the video at the beginning. The reason why I came up with 140K, again, I think that saying 140K is the market cycle peak is pretty ridiculous. Like, I don't know exactly where it's going to be, but if you're curious where I got it from, it was just extrapolating literally a couple data points, right? Taking this one to this one and recognizing it was a 0.454x move. What if we speculate again and get a 1,594 to 724%? That would put it at $141,000. Okay, so that is not a number you can take to the bank, or it's certainly not a number you can take to the bank. But it was sort of recognizing to some degree that we are likely going to experience some form of diminishing returns. Now, that brings up the question, that no one really likes talking about, or we're going to talk about anyways. This is my channel, right? Why, what is diminishing returns? What is it, and why do we talk about it? Well, imagine if you had assumed that this cycle over here was going to perform the same as the cycle before it, okay? You would have been assuming that the price would have gone up 3,500% from peak to peak. Or if you want to measure it from bottom to peak, you'd find similar ratios, right? Similar ratios. But if you were measuring it from, say, peak to peak, you'd say, all right, well, this one increased 3,500%. We would speculate that if we don't have diminishing returns, then the next one should increase by approximately 3,500%. But the thing is, if you had assumed that, you would have been off by more than half, right? By more than half. You would have the market cycle peak would have come well before you thought it was going to come. Okay, so it's because of that I prefer to be conservative. Okay, so when people talk about diminishing returns, what they mean is they just mean that they think diminishing returns will only occur, or sorry, they think that the returns will not diminish just as compared to the last cycle, okay? So that should be one thing we clarify, right? Because if they meant we're not going to see diminishing returns from the cycle before, then they are implying that Bitcoin is going to go to over $2 million this market cycle. And I think that even the most optimistic of cryptocurrency analysts would agree that we're not going to see a $2 million Bitcoin this market cycle. Okay, I think we would mostly agree with that. So the argument becomes, well, compared to last cycle, are we going to see diminishing returns? Now, what does it mean to have diminishing returns? I've seen some people say, well, you know, the idea of diminishing returns is ridiculous, and then they say they think the market cycle peak is going to be at 120K or something. 120K Bitcoin is diminishing returns. A $200,000 Bitcoin is diminishing returns. Technically, a $250,000 Bitcoin is diminishing returns. So we need to understand what is diminishing returns. What would be the way that you indicate whether it's diminished or not? Well, if you go back to this cycle, we can note that the move from $177 to $19,499 is approximately a 100x, okay? It's actually slightly more than 100x, but it's approximately 100x, meaning from bottom to top, Bitcoin moved up 100x. Now, if Bitcoin were to do that this market cycle, let's just take 100x. Remember, it's actually slightly more than 100. But let's just suppose Bitcoin were able to move up 100x this market cycle. Where would it put it? Well, from the daily close, it would mean that Bitcoin would go to $322,000. Now, from the wick down, because if you guys were watching it, we know that Bitcoin actually went down to 3,100. Even if we took it from that point instead of 100x move, it would imply that Bitcoin, if we don't have diminishing returns, would go to $310,000, okay? So to say you believe that Bitcoin is going to go to 150 or 200K, and then also say you don't agree with diminishing returns, that doesn't really make sense, because a $200,000 Bitcoin, a $150,000 Bitcoin, a $240,000 Bitcoin, that's all still technically diminished. And in order for us to not see diminishing returns, Bitcoin would need to go we need to go to 300K, right? Above 300K, if it's going to $310,000, then we've seen non-diminishing returns, okay? Now, in my position, I would really benefit if Bitcoin does not experience diminishing returns. Why? Because typically, I don't take profits on my Bitcoin that I've accumulated that's still in short-term capital gains territory. What does that mean? Well, I don't like paying such a high percentage on capital gains, and so I tend to hold my Bitcoin for at least 1 year. Therefore, at any given time, if I do want to take profits, I was taking profits over here at the prior local top. If I were to take profits at the next top, or whatever it ends up being, I probably wouldn't sell my Bitcoin in short-term capital gains territory. And why? You might say, well, why? Well, I don't want to act too deterministically about anything. Okay. Now, if Bitcoin were to go to 300K or something, then I probably would, right? I probably would bite the bullet and say, all right, we've seen the same returns that we saw last market cycle. Therefore, it makes sense for me to just take profits, and I will wish everyone luck who wants to continue riding it out. And I hope you guys make it to 500K, and I'll wish you a great voyage. I'm just not going to be there with you this market cycle. But of course, I will be there en route to those higher levels next market cycle. I think Bitcoin can make it to 500,000 next market cycle, but I think that 500,000 Bitcoin is highly unlikely this market cycle. All right. So what are the key takeaways? What are some conclusions we can draw from this? And then I'm going to talk about where I could be wrong. Okay. So I think any good analyst should try to poke holes in their own theory. And then we'll talk about what could that mean? What should be on the lookout for? So the first thing I would say is that it's highly likely that the next market cycle peak for Bitcoin is above 100,000. I've seen a lot of people say things like it's going to be 64K was the top. Obviously, they've now been proven wrong. We've already gone almost to 67K. I've seen all sorts of ranges from 70K to 80K, 90K, 100K. I know a lot of people are saying it's just going to peak at 100K and then go down. I've seen 150K, we've seen 200K. We've seen all sorts of predictions, right? I mean, the stock to flow cross asset says the average price should be 288,000, and we had him on the channel, and he says he thinks Bitcoin can overshoot $288,000. So, because in order for $288,000 to be the average price, and of course that indicates that the price actually has to go above 288K, otherwise the average price cannot be above a price that never goes above. So, with that in mind, I think there's all these theories out there, but my opinion is that it's highly likely that Bitcoin does rally above $100,000. Okay, I would say it's highly likely that it does go above $100,000. If we dubiously speculate on some of these data points, it implies it. If we look at the moves down, 3 regression bands, 2 regression bands, and 1, it implies it. There's just a lot of things that imply that the idea of a double peak cycle implies that Bitcoin should go above 100K. Okay, so I would say it is highly likely that the next market cycle peak for Bitcoin is above $100,000. But I would also say it is highly likely that the next market cycle peak for Bitcoin is below 300,000. All right, I would say it's highly likely it's below 300,000. The only reason I say that is because I want to be conservative and assume that the returns this cycle cannot match what happened last cycle, which also we're not able to match the cycle before that one, which also, by the way, we're not able to match the cycle before that one. Okay, so I would prefer to be conservative on my estimate and maybe take profits on the way up, assuming diminished returns. And then if it continues going higher to go to the 300K region, then maybe I'll bite the bullet and even take profits on my Bitcoin that's in the short-term capital gains territory. But again, that remains to be seen. So those are the 2 main points that I come away with from all this analysis on logarithmic regression. It's highly likely the next market cycle peak for Bitcoin is above 300K, but it's also highly likely that the next market cycle peak for Bitcoin is below 300. Above 100, but below 3, because above 300 would imply non-diminishing returns. So then what do I want to talk about now? I want to talk about what are some ways this could be wrong, right? What are some ways that I could be wrong? What could I be overlooking? Could it play out in a way differently than what I'm assuming? Yeah, it could. And now I want to spend a few minutes talking about that. The first thing I want to draw your attention to, and then I might even do some counter thesis points to that as well. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this. The first local top in 2013 was 263 and then ultimately went over $1,000. This is approximately a 5x move. What if Bitcoin just does 5x from this local top? Okay, if it does a 5x from this local top, we know 60K times 5 is $300,000. So if it does that, then hey, we don't have diminishing returns and Bitcoin's going to 300K whether I like it or not. And I do like it. I mean, I would love it to go to those levels. I'm just not anticipating it. So from that point, what would be the counter thesis to that statement? So if I'm first going to argue against myself and say, well, look, man, I mean, it did a 5x here. Why can't it do a 5x again? Well, the other argument would be, well, what about this? The bottom to the top here was over 100x. The bottom from this to here was not 100x, right? It was 20x. So if the first run could not keep pace, like if this run here was only a 20x, and then this one was 100x or more, why should we assume the second leg could keep pace with the second leg of this one? I'm speculating that it won't, right? I'm speculating that it won't because another 5x move would take us well over $300,000. Okay, so there's definitely positives from this video that I think people will like, right? The idea that we should be able to make it above 6 figures. But then I know there are some negatives in the sense that, okay, well, maybe people don't like me saying that it's probably not going to go above $300,000. But again, I'd rather provide unbiased analysis than tell you things that I don't necessarily believe. Now, what are some other things that could affect it? Well, what if instead of going into a mania mode immediately, what if Bitcoin just kind of slowly goes up, right? And it doesn't go into a mania mode. What if we just slowly move up? Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that Bitcoin is just going to go sideways for 2 years and then go up, right? But there's always possibilities, of course. And if Bitcoin were to just slowly ride this purple line for a long time, and then maybe eventually we do have a move to the upside, well, then maybe by that point we could go to much higher levels without going back down to these lower regression bands. Okay, so that would be that point to make. If the market cycle just continues on and on and on, and we instead of getting say like 85% corrections, let's just suppose we just keep getting like 50 or 60% corrections that only take 3 to 6 months to recover from, then yeah, maybe we could go much higher. And then you start to question, well, what are cycles? I already know a lot of people who would say that this is more than one cycle. Like this is one cycle here, and then this is another one. So at some point, I think the definition of market cycles is already becoming ambiguous. And as we continue on, it might even become harder to discern what separates one market cycle from another. There's some people that might already say that we're already in another market cycle because they assumed that this was a market cycle here, we came back down, and then we started a new market cycle similar to 2013. I would argue that it's the same market cycle, but I can at least understand where they're coming from, right? And you should be able to understand that too. It is somewhat ambiguous where exactly a market cycle ends, okay? So that's another place that we could, I could be wrong about the whole diminishing returns, is if the cycle just continues on and on and on and on, then we could see something like that play out where maybe Bitcoin goes to $300,000, but it just takes it a lot longer to get there. Like I certainly don't think it can make it there this year, and probably not even next year either. But that would be something I think that would be important to think about as well. All right. And then of course there's other things that maybe could affect things, as Michael Saylor says. What if a few billionaires just decide they want to buy Bitcoin? How do you put that into your models? Well, I would argue that the model, I said this back when Bitcoin was at $5,000. I said back then, we need institutions to get to $100,000 Bitcoin, right? Like we needed that money. We need that money to get to reach those higher levels. But at the end of the day, if on a given day, Apple, Facebook, Google, if all these institutions decide, they're just all going to buy Bitcoin, I don't know. I don't know. What if a government, obviously there are some governments, right? But what if some larger governments start deciding they want to buy Bitcoin? That could affect things as well. And I'm not going to pretend like it can't. What are some other things that could affect it? Well, the US dollar currency index has mostly been moving up since Bitcoin's been around. If you follow my analysis on the on DXY, the US dollar currency index, you'll know that the main times it goes down, Bitcoin goes up. In 2017, and in 2020 and early 2021, we know Bitcoin went up during that time, so the dollar was going down. But if you look at the whole history of the dollar, and since Bitcoin has been around, it's actually gone up a lot. So what happens if the dollar instead goes down for the next 3 years? That would probably, if history is any indication, the dollar going down would be good for Bitcoin, and it would also be good for the stock market. So if the dollar does go down for a couple more years, then really there's no telling, right? There's no telling what could happen if it goes into a very long move back to the downside. And if you look at the dollar and you zoom out on a decade time frame, it's in the middle of, it put in two very long concave up patterns. We could potentially be in the third one. So we have to consider that as well. So there's plenty of ways that I could be wrong, right? There's plenty of ways I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. But I just wanted to do an update on that video that was published back in 2019. We speculated back then, look, the end of 2021 is the absolute earliest that you could probably see a market cycle peak, right? And we said that back then. It's the absolute earliest, and it's essentially going along with the 4-year cycle, okay? But it also does show that the cycle is lengthening as measured from the halving, right? It is lengthening as measured from the halving. It's already lengthened as measured from the halving. The only question now is, will it lengthen enough to get us into 2022 or not? Okay, I'm hoping it does, right? I'm hoping that the cycle does go well into 2022. But if we get a parabolic move in November or December that's taking us up to 150, 200K, then there's a very, very high probability that is the market cycle peak, and the cycle technically lengthened from the halving, but it was not consequential enough to make it any different than what more people would say, okay, it's just going to happen at the end of every year. Note that the first cycle, if you include the one before the halvings, actually peaked in the summer. So this was a summer peak, a November peak, a December peak. Maybe the next one will be a January peak, right? Maybe it goes to the first month of 2021. Maybe it goes into later in Q1, or maybe it goes into Q2, or even beyond that. But I think for now, what we need to do before we speculate on that too much is, let's just see where time takes us, okay? We're near the end of October now, right? We're near the end of October. Bitcoin is trading for $61,000, okay? Bitcoin's trading for 61K, and there certainly is a decent probability that it could continue trending higher. The only question is it going to trend high enough where we go too far up too quickly because the market becomes irrational and therefore it leads into a long bear market? Or are we going to continue to sort of bide our time and wait for that final parabolic rally? Only time will tell. What is a key takeaway from this? No matter what you think about, say, the timing of a market cycle peak, first of all, if you assume that the market cycle peak is not in, what can we all infer? Time is on our side. So let's just take it 1 week at a time. We'll see where Bitcoin takes us. As far as I can tell, time is on our side. We just need to be patient. Don't worry so much about short-term drops in the market. You're going to get those. They're going to happen all the time. Nothing moves up monotonically. Just take it 1 week at a time. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. We also do have the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com. If you want to know how I'm navigating these markets, you will get access to weekly reports and videos, the Telegram alerts channel, the Telegram chat room, the risk dashboard, and more. Make sure you check it out, intothecryptoverse.com. You can find a link to that in the description below as well. Subscribe, click the bell icon to turn on notifications, and I will see you next time.